Everybody, welcome. Let me just stall for another second as everybody comes into the Zoom. And we are so delighted to see you today for our Siyyum on Tractate Zevachim. Things are getting real. Okay, here we go. All right. So my name is Rachel Scheinerman. I have the pleasure of editing My Jewish Learning and a daily dose of Talmud. And you are here, I hope, for a Siyyum on Tractate Zevachim, the first tractate in the fifth order of the Talmud, which is all about sacrifices. I feel like we say this a lot when we start a Siyyum, but I think this has been a challenging one for folks. Folks have found this a tough one, I think, especially to connect to, because for us, spiritual experiences are not mediated, at least hopefully not mediated these days, by shedding animal blood. So we've had to work a little harder, I think, to create meaning out of these pages. And they've also been very intellectually challenging, really complicated arguments the rabbis are making. But indeed, I think we have faced down these difficult arguments. We have searched deep to find meaning, and we've explored the emotional side of sacrifices and taken a lot of time to really appreciate how embodied and visceral a tradition Judaism is at heart. But you don't have to take my word for it here, because as we close the door on Zevachim and celebrate getting through all 119 pages over the last 3 months, we've as always invited 3 presenters to take a look back on some moments from this tractate. So let me go ahead and introduce them now. So Rabbanit Dasi Fruchter, give us a wave.
Hey, Mazel Tov.
Rabbanit Fruchter is the founder and director of the South Philadelphia Shtibel, and as you know, you can study Daf Yomi every day with her on her podcast, which is sensibly named Daf Yomi with Rabbanit Dasi Fruchter. We are also joined with Rabbi Asher Lopatin.
Hey everybody, Mazel Tov.
Rabbi Lopatin is the spiritual leader of Kehilat Eitz Chaim in Detroit, Michigan, and the community relations director at the Greater Ann Arbor Jewish Federation. And we are joined also by Dr. Sarah Ronis.
Hi everyone, Mazel Tov.
Dr. Ronis is a professor of theology at St. Mary's University, where she teaches courses on Hebrew Bible and its interpretation, and of course a regular writer for the Daf Yomi series from My Jewish Learning. As always, you are an important part of this Siyyum, so please make generous use of the comment section. Engage with me, engage with our presenters. Tell us what you're thinking about as you leave this tractate. What did you take from it? What are you still struggling with? What would you like to discuss today? Our presenters have packaged up 3 little bits of text for us to return to in this celebratory moment in this Siyyum, but we are happy to range far and wide. So with that in mind, and also it is always very fun if you tell us where you're from, because seeing the geographical reach of this community is really always a pleasure. So if you feel like popping that into the chat, please share that as well. Okay, so let us go ahead and kick off today with Rabbi Lopatin, who is here today with methods of Midrash, some good, vegetables for us in Talmud study, right? Ways that rabbis think about interpreting text with some examples from this tractate.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Scheinerman. So I'm going to, don't worry about it, because I'm going to deal with a very difficult, something called casuistry, very Talmudic kind of terms, and I'm not really going to explain them very well, so don't worry about it. So it's based on Daf Nun 50 and 50A and 50B, where it delves into Hekesh, sort of a juxtaposition, versus Binyan Av, which is sort of constructing a paradigm. Don't worry about these things. And what I want to just talk about is that the rabbis themselves, I think, in the Talmud, there's a lot of humor here. And I think they understood that they're kind of building halachic understandings about the sacrifices from, I don't want to say a House of Cards. I'm actually rewatching that series, but sort of just that they're given a lot of freedom and a lot of ability to decide halacha from things that are kind of, I don't want to say flimsy, but sort of all different crazy techniques. And, we say, I mean, sometimes I get the chance to do korbanot in the morning, to actually read about the sacrifices, the daily offering, maybe the Shabbat offering in the morning. And at the end of all that, of Ezehu Mekoman, that's the chapter it's from, where do all these sacrifices, where do you spill the blood, where do you take the blood, where do you offer, where do you slaughter the animal, all that stuff. You can say it every day, and it ends with Rabbi Ishmael, the 13 theoretical ways of learning from Rabbi Ishmael. This is from the Sifra, from Vayikra. In the very beginning of Vayikra. And he has a whole bunch of different ways of learning. But what's fun about what our Gemara does on Nun Amud Aleph on 50a is it starts on the top of the page in Midatana de Ishmael. It says, if you davar halamed behekesh, some kind of halachic decision about the sacrifices that is learned through putting two verses together, juxtaposition, they're coming together, the same term. Moshe Yelamed, something that is already learned from a certain way of learning. Can it teach in a different way, in a binyan av? So again, I don't want to really go into, it's really hard to put this in your head together, but it just shows that the rabbis are having a good time playing with this and are able to be super creative with these sacrifices, which are sort of ancient ritual. So they go through it, and these both dapim goes through all sorts of things, and then it says davar halamed behekesh ein choser malamed bevinyan, something that learns what maybe can't. Maybe you can't combine the two. And then it talks about Gzeira Shava. Gzeira Shava is usually you see the same word in two different contexts. It teaches us that the halacha is the same. So we say, what about if something is learned through a Gzeira Shava, can it teach with a hekesh? Can then, once we learned that, can it go and teach it? So, and then even more fun is davar halal, as you go down the daf, and I'm not going to give examples of this, but davar alamed b'gzeira shava, let's see something, a halachic understanding for a certain sacrifice is learned through a gzeira shava, having the same word in two verses. Can then it go ahead and give another gzeira shava for something else? And it's really just, the question is, how much should we limit the power of the rabbis to be super creative and to come up with, like Dr. Scheinerman was saying, like the ingredients, the vegetables, add to the soup of the korbanot. On the top of 50b, I think there's something really very funny. I don't know, maybe they didn't see it as funny, but it says, davar halamed b'gzeira shava. Okay, so we learn a certain halacha by the same word being used in two different places. Maushi halamed b'kal v'chomer. Now we bring in the whole idea of a kal v'chomer, a fortiori, something that is obvious that if this happens, then obviously this lesser, like a stronger, a kal, if it's really a tough halacha, then certainly it could teach about something that is much more easy. I'm not explaining it that well, but what I want to get is a little joke here. So it says something that's learned through a gzeira shava. Can it teach through a kal v'chomer? And the Gemara answers, kal v'chomer. Well, so I'm going to tell you that a gzeira shava, a certain way of learning, can teach through a kal v'chomer. How am I going to show it to you? Well, it's a kal v'chomer. So they're really having a lot of fun with these things, and sometimes they say, forget it. This is too difficult. This is too complicated. Something that's learned through a gzeira shava same word there. Can it teach through a binyan av? All these, by the way, if you say them every day, they're listed. The 13 ways of Rabbi Shmuel are all listed there in your Sidurim, if you have the Siddur that has it. And the answer is, like, I don't know, something that learns through a Gzeira Shava. You get a halacha that is derived through a Gzeira Shava. Can it teach through a binyan ab, setting up a paradigm? What's the answer? Teiko. Let Eliyahu Hanavi come and resolve this. And we get another Teiko for some of these other things. It's really just, I think that it just shows that the rabbis are a little bit self-reflective. And they understand how they're really building up a lot of laws, a lot of understandings through what they're claiming to be perhaps even Torah from Sinai, but it's really the power that they have to make up these laws about the sacrifices. And again, they're living in a time when there weren't even sacrifices anywhere. I'll just end with really a lot of fun that they're really having. Something that is learned through a fortiori, davar mikal v'chomer. Can it teach through a kal v'chomer? Again, this is a joke. Well, it's obvious that it can. But then as you go through 50b, zeu kal v'chomer, ben kal v'chomer, ben benosho kal v'chomer. So it's a fortiori, a way of learning from different kinds of halacha, an easy one to a hard one, son of an easy one to a hard one, grandson of an easy one to a hard one. So it just shows that they understand how this is a crazy system, and somehow they have to manage it. Somehow they have to argue with it. But I think on this page, it just shows that there is a lot of creativity and a lot of wiggle room that we have with the laws of sacrifices. And that really shows us that, on the one hand, we could be a little cynical and say, oh my gosh, this whole thing is based on a grandson, a kal v'chomer that's a son of a kal v'chomer, that's a grandson of a kal v'chomer, that, they're just playing with these techniques. So we could be a little cynical about it. On the other hand, the rabbis are taking this seriously and they're arguing it out. And it just shows that, just end with the idea that King David says, "Ulei Toratcha shashu'ai kvar avadati boni." King David, one of his sad, difficult moments, said, "I need the Torah as a plaything, as a toy. Otherwise, I would have perished." And so it gives us a sense that this is serious stuff. This is stuff that, you're liable to the death penalty if you do it wrong and all that. On the other hand, it's a toy, it's a game, it's something that should be fun and enjoyable. And so with all the challenges that this Masechet is and the sacrifices are, let's not take away the joy and the fun of halachic, of legal understanding of the Talmud. Okay, back to you, Dr. Shinerman.
Thank you, Rabbi Lopatin. I think it is worth highlighting the playfulness of interpretation in rabbinic texts. Dr. Ronas and I had a professor in grad school who was always doing that, right? Always talking about how playful and joyful a lot of interpretation is. And you see some of this in the Talmud, and if folks have a chance to enjoy some of the midrashic literature, it gets even more playful and joyful. Okay, we have a couple of questions for you, Rabbi Lopatin, about interpretive methods, and then some more general comments on the tractate, and then we'll move on to the next presenter. So Linda Clifton says, are they saying that these techniques of interpretation are themselves halakha?
They are tradition, I would say. They are, and there's a whole discussion of certainly Gzeira Shava. I know that traditional authorities say you can only say a Gzeira Shava, meaning that saying that this one word or phrase or letter links two different laws, if you have a tradition from Sinai. So I would say they're not themselves, they're maybe what we would say a hechsher halacha, a hechsher mitzvah, their preparation for a halacha, but they're really based tremendously, mostly on what they say is tradition. And that's, academics who know much more than I do will argue about what does that really mean. But I think to some extent the rabbis really thought that this is what Moshe was taught at Sinai. So I would say tradition more than halacha.
Okay, and the other question directly relating to your presentation comes from Karen, who said, I have been wondering about how interpretive technique is decided. It often feels arbitrary, right? If we think of it as the rabbis have a whole toolbox of interpretive techniques, how do they decide which technique to apply to which text?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think some of it comes from their rabbi, their teacher, what their teacher did. I think a lot of it really is it just gets fought out in the Beit Midrash. It gets argued, and sometimes there's a glitch, and it's just take-o. We can't resolve it, but I think the it welcomes these different ways of understanding. Really welcome true argumentation, and that's the critical part of it. So they're really these crazy, is it a Gzeira Shava? Is it a Hekesh? Is it a Binyan Av? All these different things. They're just sort of gateways into having some really good arguments and discussions. And ultimately, it really, I don't know how strongly. I think if someone's teacher taught them this, then they hold of it very strongly. Otherwise, they're really just sort of throwing the possibility. It's almost like brainstorming in the Talmud, and then it gets argued out, and then whoever's the most convincing to the most people wins the day. Hopefully, that's a little bit helpful in answering that.
Thank you. Okay, sometimes I cold call on people in the comments. So Paul Schlichtman, would you come to the microphone for us? He didn't get any warning, by the way, folks. They never do. And he said this tractate has removed every ounce of romanticism for ancient priests. I thought this was an interesting perspective on the role of priests. They turn out to be technicians and functionaries with a messy and precise, and I would say physically taxing job that carries significant risks when they get it wrong, which I thought was really interesting. But the part of the question I wanted to ask you about is how are you romanticizing the priests before this tractate?
The thing is, the thought of the high priest and the vestments and the status sounded pretty good at first, but then you realize what a priest does, and there's nothing really joyous, romantic, or I certainly wouldn't want to aspire to this job.
Okay. I'm curious. Thank you for sharing that. That's a good observation. I wonder if other folks, Dr. Ennis, you should be able to unmute yourself.
I am, but I was just being polite. It's the teacher in me. You got to raise your hand. Paul, your comment made me think about surgeons, right? The exact same kind of like really technical, gross, visceral kind of behavior or actions, which are really high status in society. And like being a surgeon is fancy. Certainly in the United States, the pay reflects that. And it is super important to life, right? Like it helps our society function. And also when we actually think about what they do all day, it's kind of gross.
Rabbi Lopatin, jump in.
Yeah,
I appreciate all the polite hand raising. This many
Sorry, I
tractates.
know. Dr. Rona started. I think, it's interesting. The rabbis, didn't really like the priests so much and did not want to romanticize it. And for a long time they were in conflict with the Pharisees and Sadducees, but these are the rabbis. So they wanted the romance to be in the Beit Midrash and not in the temple, even though the contradictorily they're kind of supporting. This whole tractate is about the temple, but I think that might have been sort of on purpose, Paul, to really just make them functionaries, and the real drama is occurring in the Beit Midrash.
Okay, I'm going to shift the conversation now to a perennial one, and I think we have 3 questions in the chat that get at the same kind of question in the same way. All of them are about what's going on with the transition in Judaism from a sacrificial religion to a non-sacrificial religion. So Aaron Boxer says, was it an undebated and unanimous decision when the Tanaim prohibited all sacrifice? Or was the discussion of sacrificial practice before the temple part of making that choice? Okay, so I'm going to ask folks to hold these three questions together. Ruth says, I kept wondering about those who want to rebuild the temple and reinstate sacrifice. Would they update the rituals at all? For example, cleaning the messy priest's robes with urine? Do you think they would update and use detergent? Okay, so Aaron's asking about when sacrifice was prohibited. Ruth is asking about reinstating sacrifice and would it look exactly the same in modern times when we maybe have more effective and sophisticated detergents. And Ezra says the Talmud was undertaken as a new form of Judaism given the elimination of temple sacrifice and the dispersal of the Jews to many lands. So why even have a whole tractate devoted to sacrifice? Didn't we decide this was over? So let's go ahead and address, especially since this is Tractate one of many on sacrifice. Let's go ahead and address what is going on here. And if you are confused, that is not a surprise because it's not always so clear from the rabbinic text, and scholars have not always been so clear on it either. Do any of our presenters want to take a crack at this?
I always want to talk, but I want to let Dr. Ronas and Rabbanit Fruchter go, and then I'm happy. I always have something to say. Okay, I'll
All
start.
right, I can take a crack at this
Great,
because
great.
I wrote a dissertation on Passover and the Paschal sacrifice, and the reason I got into it is I really thought that would be a great place to explore how the rabbis intentionally created a non-sacrificial Judaism. And I looked at it and I wanted to see it in the really early stages and I wanted to see it happening in the Tannaitic sources. And I ended up writing like the antithesis of what I thought I would write because after spending so much time with the sources, I really concluded that they had no interest in getting rid of sacrifices. I mean, they have definitely a dislike of the priestly class. There's no doubt about that, and a suspicion of the priestly class and a power struggle with the priestly class. But my view of those very early rabbis, and this might be different for the later rabbis, but those very early rabbis, the ones in the Mishnah and the Tosefta that predate the Amoraim of the Gemara, my sense from spending a couple years in those sources was really that they weren't interested in getting rid of sacrifice. They were actually really interested in being ready to bring it back. That was my sense of those sources. And so all those sources in the 10th chapter of Pesachim, which are the basis of the contemporary Seder, do not read to me as a script for a Haggadah. They read to me as a script for how to go offer your Paschal sacrifice. And they did end up becoming the script for the Haggadah, but I don't get the sense from reading them that that was really what the rabbis had in mind. And arguably, that could be true for later rabbis as well, that a lot of the point of studying sacrifice is maybe more practical than we'd like to assume.
I think I'd also just add that there is some historical evidence that some Jewish communities continue to engage in some form of animal sacrifice after the destruction of the temple. Certainly not the rabbis, but much like the world today, there are many Jews in the ancient world who are not members of the rabbinic movement. And we know that where the rabbis are living, lots of other religious communities are performing animal sacrifice. And I also just want to note, for those who feel like this is all really distant, it is distant in the Jewish past, but there are lots of religious communities today across the religious world who do perform animal sacrifice and are people who live in our world and are doctors and lawyers and priests and functionaries of various kind for whom it is still a deeply religiously meaningful practice.
Yes, and a lot of sacrifice went away in the Western world in the late antique, early medieval period. So there was an external trend toward away from sacrifice, though not among Hindus. But I don't know how much contact the rabbis had. All right, Rabbi Lopatin, you ready to jump in?
Okay, well, I'm not going to disagree with 3 years of research that you did. So,
It was very limited to like the Paschal sacrifice in Tannaitic, early rabbinic, like even
no,
pre-Talmud sources. So I'm very far from the
no,
final
no.
word on
No,
anything.
but we had a kind of a crackpot rabbi in my synagogue, Rabbi Rakov, who he felt that when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the Talmud depicts it as a mistake that he did not say to Caesar or whatever, to the general, don't destroy the temple when he had that opportunity, that he actually on purpose wanted the temple destroyed because he really wanted to get away from these sacrifices and everything. And so I think I romanticize a Judaism where the sacrifices do provide a authenticity. And even when, again, I like saying them in the morning, the sacrifice, because it gives a certain authenticity. It gives us strength that you can do something, you can be active to energize God and that kind of thing. But I like to romanticize that. And I guess I don't have as much proof that they really wanted to get away from the sacrifices. And there are these midrashim that do say that in the future, almost all the sacrifices will be eliminated. So, when I say the traditional musaf on Shabbat and holidays and Rosh Chodesh that mentions the sacrifices, but I always think that we'll do them be'ahava, through love. We'll do it in a different way without slaughtering and killing and blood. So I just have a romantic view of it, but I think that Rabbi Rockoff, he had this idea also that it's just gives the rabbis authenticity, but they didn't want to restore these sacrifices. So I don't have a lot to go on, but that's sort of what I want to believe.
All right, I think I'm the timekeeper here. So as interesting as this discussion is, and as hard as it is to come to a definitive answer about such a sweeping question as this, maybe because like things are messy and complicated and not everyone agreed and things happened in fits and starts, I am going to leave it there and we are going to move on to our second presentation. Who did I say would be next? Dr. Ronis, you are up.
Amazing. So I'm going to share my screen just so everybody can look at the text with me. And I'm really interested in thinking with you and sharing with you this piece from the tail end of Tractate Zevachim, where Yitro comes to visit Moshe. He comes to visit Moses, and and the Torah says Yitro heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. And the Talmud asks a somewhat funny question, which is, what does Yitro hear that he came and converted? So the Talmud asks this question, right? They assume when Yitro came, that he came to join the Jewish people in Egypt, in the desert, excuse me. And they ask, what is it exactly that Yitro heard that made him think, all the way in Midian, I need to go convert and be a part of the Jewish people? Now, it's a little bit funny to me because the verse actually tells us he heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, and how they had brought him out of Egypt. Right? So that is literally what he heard. But the Talmud seems to be more interested in, is there a specific event that he heard about? Is there something, all that God had done? What is more specifically happening there? And I think, we can always be skeptical about, oh, I just heard everything and I agreed, right? Like, what actually changed your mind, right? So that's what they're asking. Rabbi Yoshua says, he heard about the war with Amalek, as it is written next to Exodus 18, and Joshua weakened Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword, right? That Joshua and the Israelites beat Amalek in this battle. Yitro heard about this great military victory, and that's what really convinced him to join the Jewish people. And here I think we have a model of people are impressed with us and respect us when we show military might. We then get another opinion. Rabbi Elazar Hamodai says, he heard about the giving of the Torah and came. As when the Torah was given to the Jewish people, the voice of God went from one end of the world to the other end, and all of the kings of the nations of the world were overcome with trembling in their palaces and recited a song, as it is stated, the voice of the Lord makes the hinds to calve, and in his palace all say glory. Right, so Rabbi Elazar Hamoda'i takes us in a really different direction. He says, no, what he heard was about the giving of the Torah, which is interesting on a, so the question that Rabbi Elazar Hamoda'i asks is, okay, well, how did they hear about it? And the answer is when God gave the Jewish people the Torah, God did so in a way that was incredibly, incredibly loud. And we learn from Psalms that every king in their own palace praises God at the sound of the giving of the Torah. And it's particularly interesting to me because this is not what the verse in Exodus says, right? The verse in Exodus says what everything that God had done for Moses and Israel, how they had brought Israel out of Egypt. It doesn't say anything about giving the Torah. In fact, and I'm not the first to notice this, the Talmud notices this as well, the verses about Yitro happen before the giving of the Torah. Now, the rabbis don't necessarily think the Torah is telling the story in chronological order, so that's not a problem for them. But I want to note that this is like a particularly interesting way to interpret what Yitro heard, right? What Yitro heard here is about the giving of the Torah. And then we get this sort of really interesting vignette. All of the kings gathered around Bilam the wicked and said to him, "What is the tumultuous sound that we have heard?" So Balaam is the non-Jewish prophet who is hired by King Balak at one point to curse the Israelites in the desert. And he is our classic example of a non-Jewish prophet in the Hebrew Bible, certainly in the Torah. And so in this vignette, all of these kings hear this great noise and they run to the prophet Balaam to say, yo, what was that noise? And he said to them, he has a good and precious item in his treasury that was hidden away with him for 974 generations before the world was created. And he seeks to give it to his children. As it is stated, the Lord will give strength to his people. And immediately they all began to say, the Lord will bless his people with peace. Right, so at the time of Moses, we are 26 generations from Adam. And so they are imagining that the Torah has already been around for 1,000 generations at the time of the giving of the Torah, right? 974 generations before the world was created. And that's what they hear. And everyone, all of these people start praising God, right? So here we have this really interesting model of what is it that makes people impressed by us, want to join us. It's the Torah, right? It's this beautiful gift from God, this relationship with God, right? Balaam tells these non-Jewish kings that the Israelites are God's people, and they all agree, right? It's that relationship as embodied by the Torah that really highlights or makes our light shine. And that's very different from our first model. And then we get a third model. Rabbi Eliezer said, he heard about the splitting of the Red Sea and came, as it is stated, and it came to pass when all the kings of the Amorites that were beyond the Jordan, right, everybody heard that the Lord had dried up the Jordan and passed over, right? Everybody heard about the splitting of the sea. Now, here's what's really interesting about this. If you know your book of Joshua, which I personally feel is understudied by the Jewish world in general for some challenging theological reasons, this is not actually talking about the splitting of the sea. It's talking about the drying up of the Jordan, which is a miracle that happens in the book of Joshua. We do hear about the splitting of the sea, however, earlier in the book of Joshua, when Rahab says, oh, we've heard about the splitting of the sea and how amazing this miracle is. So the Talmud doesn't give us an answer. Several of you have noted in the chat that in some ways this is the least satisfying tractate so far. We don't get a lot of answers in general, perhaps because they don't feel this urgency of coming up with an answer because they need to practice it now, right? They're not getting a question from a congregant that says like, okay, but is this kosher tonight, right? Like, can I use this spoon tonight? This is a little bit more theoretical, but so we don't get an answer. But I think what the rabbis are presenting there is sort of three different models about what can make the Jewish people special in the eyes of the non-Jewish world. Or at the very least, because Yitro is not Yitro is not a stand-in for everyone, right? At least for a sympathetic non-Jewish individual. And I think, right, we see this model of it's military strength, or it's our relationship to God and Torah, or it's the actual physical miracles that everybody sees, right? It's these embodied miracles in our world, right? Is it the stuff that we did? Is it the relationship that we have and the way we observe the Torah? Or is it what God does for us and we are passive? And the Talmud doesn't give us an answer, but I think as we continue to study in Tractate coaching, really thinking about what are we doing? And what is it in what we do or don't do that makes us people who can be a light unto the nations? I think is something that may be hard for us to think about as we're reading about the delicacies of how do you kill a bird in the temple with a thumbnail. But I also think is very rich for us to continue to think about. So I want to encourage us to keep thinking about what is it that we can find in these tractates that can help us be a light unto the nations in a world which desperately needs more light.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Folks are definitely dilating on this image of the Torah having been created so many generations before being received by Moses, 1,000 generations before Moses received it at Sinai. And it creates all kinds of logical conundrums, like big ones and little ones, like what's a generation before there are people, right? And then questions about free will. Well, if God wrote down everything that happened ahead of time, right? And I just wanted to share this idea also comes up in Tractate Shabbat. So I'm putting the link in the chat where God is about to give the Torah to Moses and the angels are kind of like, what are you doing letting a human up here? And what are you doing giving this treasure that is so old to the human beings, which I think just adds like another really interesting dimension. And I do think like my take, I don't know if it's a good one, but my take is you don't want to think about it too logically. It's an emotional statement about the foundational nature of Torah to the world.
There's another understudied biblical book is the book of Proverbs. Proverbs 8, Mishlei 8, has a beautiful speech by Wisdom, who the rabbis read as Torah, who says, I was delighting with God in heaven before the creation of the world. And depending on how you translate particular rare Hebrew words, I was God's master craftsman, right? Almost as though God gave the Torah the blueprints and then the Torah created the world. Which is a wild theological statement, and one that in Proverbs, at least, expands beyond the Jewish people, right? If everything comes from Torah, it's not actually about an individual relationship. And I don't think that's where the rabbis go with it. I want to be very clear. But the idea that the Torah existed or wisdom existed before creation is one that the rabbis are not coming up with themselves. That is an ancient idea by their time.
And if you like these ideas, you might also, I'll go ahead and plug our series on Zohar because the Kabbalists go crazy with all these ideas and just take them to all kinds of new and very exciting places. And that even more so than the Talmud, they just get really creative with these ideas. But we're going to come back to Earth because we have only 20 minutes left in this program, and I want to make sure we have time to learn from Rabbanit Fruchter and also properly close out our Siyyum.
Amazing. I love learning with all of you. This is so fun. Whenever Dr. Rona says this is an understudied book, I'm like, when are we starting that series at the Stiebel? We got to do it. But I totally agree with you. Thank you so much. So just to start with like a little jokey thing that I've been thinking about for most of Masachet Zevachim. The first time I ever went to the Jerusalem Zoo, raise your hand, have you ever been there? Zoo, a biblical zoo in Jerusalem? All right. So they have a section dedicated to animals that were offered as sacrifices. And I remember going there as like an eighth grader, and thinking, do these guys do idol worship every night so that the temple doesn't return so they can remain unscathed? And then this is the chuckle I've had for the entire 3 months that we've been learning this tractate. So that's just one thing I needed to get off my chest. Thank you so much. But in all honesty, listening to our conversation today about learning this complicated Masechta with theological questions and ethical concerns, like we don't even do this anymore. What's this for? How can we fit it into historical context? What does it mean when the next temple will come? I wanted to share with you that for me as a Talmud learner, these kinds of questions sometimes get me stuck. I feel that my approach to learning sometimes gets stuck with my need to understand the full historical picture or to understand how this would actually translate in our lives today. And what I've pushed myself to do through the study of Daf Yomi is to dedicate a type of learning in the Yiddish / Hebrew word is like tamimistic, which means like simplicity, wholehearted simplicity, and spiritual openness. And so as these hard questions come up, I'm like, that's a hard question. And also, I'm just going to keep going. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep going. And I'm going to see what spiritual lesson emerges, knowing that I haven't resolved every single ethical or theological question. And this is something that emerged for me when I started teaching the cycle back in the women's department. I started with Masachat Nida, the tractate on menstruation, and I found that I got stuck every time I wanted to have like a discourse with myself about feminism, right? So what does it look like to jump into the text and be open to the spiritual messages it gives while retaining a constant bank of questions alongside the learning? And what I found is that Masechet Zevachim, this tractate, though it was really, really hard, there were a lot of profound teachings about holiness and Jewish life. I found the intellectual part the hardest, actually, about this particular tractate. And as a case study, I want to look at one section with you. It's towards the end, the last third of the tractate, and it's from the 10th chapter, called Kol HaTadir. Yes, I agree with you, Miriam. Starting with Nida was bizarre. It was an interesting question, interesting choice. But this particular chapter is all about when multiple sacrifices need to be brought, which one comes first? Is it the one that is tadir, more frequent, or the one that is mikudash, holier? Now, I want you all to think about a moment where there were multiple mitzvahs put in front of you, and you don't know which one to do first. The classic example that's brought is like there's a few Torah readings to do, or a few liturgical things that need to be fit in. But even more than that, you've got Shabbos candles and Hanukkah candles. You've got talis and tefillin. You have a Kohen and a Levite. You have these questions about priority and process in spiritual life. And when you have something as complex as the temple, there's a need to set a schedule with like very clear priorities about what comes first. And our human instinct is generally that thing is so special, that's the thing that must have to come first. Right? The thing that is rarest, most beautiful, most unique, that should take center stage, and everything else that's common should remain in the background, and we should do that afterwards. But it's the opposite. It's totally the opposite. We learn in the 10th chapter of Zevachim that what comes first, the more common or the most frequent, comes before the rarer, right? When multiple sacrifices need to be brought, the most frequent sacrifice comes first, and the holier or, less frequent comes second. Now, there's an unresolved debate about this section, which is what happens when there's a direct conflict between two kinds of sacrifices. So I want everyone to imagine Rachel, Dr. Schneiderman, just with two goats, all right? Just look at those goats. They're so small in her hands, right? And she has two different sacrifices she needs to bring. One is more frequent. It happens perhaps every day. Maybe it's a tamid or something like that. But the other is holier. And the way that's defined by the Talmud is something that atones totally, right? Like, for example, like a sin offering. And she's like, oh my gosh, I'm an ancient priest. Which one am I going to do first? And guess what? The Gemara leaves it unresolved. And the Rambam, Maimonides, later on says it's whichever one she wants. If those are equal in weight, right, those two goats, that holy versus frequent, then she has to choose which one comes first. I think it's really instructive that we don't resolve this debate fully, though generally we say that the more frequent or more common comes first. There are cases where it is not as clear. And so there I am, learning this tractate all about animal sacrifices, being hit in the face with a massive spiritual lesson, right? That the Mea Shiloach, the Ishbitzer, really fascinating piece on this Gemara, based in the Parsha of Pinchas, where some of these psukim come up. He reads this whole discussion as the following. Tadir means patience, consistent action, and process following. That always comes first in Judaism, unless we get trapped by our own overthinking. And in that case, we jump in to Mikudash, to holy. We have to jump into the holy if we find we're getting mired in process. We find that we're getting mired in this idea of doing things very, very consistently. So in general, I think this unresolved Gemara teaches us that Jewish life requires both models, the discipline of consistency and the courage to act with really a lot of decisiveness when it seems like there's something deliciously holy at hand and we need to jump in and we need to do it. I'm going to tell you, just to close, the verses that the Mei HaShiloach brings to prove his point, because it's so cool. So what's the verse in the Torah that teaches us to keep kosher and not mix meat and milk? Anybody know? One of the major ones, don't cook a kid in its mother's milk, right? So that's the pasuk, that's the verse. The verse right before that is actually about bringing first fruits. Okay, so bringing the first fruits to the temple instead of consuming them yourself. So what the Mei HaShiloach says is, you know what? Generally, we have discipline. We bring our first fruits to the temple and we don't just eat all the figs that when they're ripe. We don't just go, nom, 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 right? We have real good spiritual discipline and practice. But sometimes we imagine in our heads something as impetuous as a goat that breaks through and says, I'm here, right? Sometimes you have to jump in. The goat, by the way, is brought as an example in the Tractate of Sukkah as the kind of animal that breaks walls, right? So don't cook a kid in its mother's milk means, like, yes, the spiritual practice of the first fruits, but also sometimes we got to be a goat. We just got to be a goat. We got to step in and ruin the order of priorities when it is most necessary. So may we have the spiritual fortitude to be able to show up with that korban tamid, with that daily sacrifice day after day, but also sometimes to remember that Dr. Schneiderman holds two goats in her hands and she's not always sure which one should come first. And that's our job, to learn the lessons of the Gemara, to let it wash over us, so we have the moral and spiritual instinct to be able to know when to break through that particular order of priorities. Yasher koach, everybody. More spirituality when we make pancakes in the next tractate. Because it's grains. Grains.
Thank you. Yes, we just had a request in the chat for an introductory Siyyum, which isn't really a Siyyum, like an introductory lesson to each tractate. In addition to it, we always take stock at the end. And I will then therefore plug our Thursday morning Daf Yomi Week in Review class. We do not officially say this, but usually the first presentation in a new tractate does function much like an introduction to the tractate. At the beginning of Zevachim, Dr. Ronas gave us Sacrifice 101. on the first week of that tractate. So if you are so inclined, the link to sign up is in the bottom of every single email we send. So you should be able to find it there. We do meet for a half hour on Thursday mornings to just do kind of what we do here. Take a quick back look at some highlights of what the heck happened in Daf Yomi this week. So, and often the first one is a little more forward looking. We are right at that time where we need to sort of close out this program. So thank you all for these really thoughtful and, as always, more diverse than I could plan for and more enriching than I could hope for presentations. And to all of you for all these comments. We are going to end with some ritual. How do we do this? Dr. Ronas, why don't you take us through the last few lines of this tractate so we can officially come to the end, and then we will say the Hadran and the Kaddish.
Excellent. And I will just note for everyone that the ending of this tractate is very on brand. Oftentimes, the anonymous editors of the Talmud like to end the tractate with something really inspiring or like a nice idea to take with. And that doesn't happen here. So it is incumbent on us to really find that meaning. So we're in the middle of a discussion about whether the ways that we sacrifice birds is the same on a private altar versus a communal altar in the days before there was a temple. So we're now going back to not just one imagined past ago, but two imagined pasts ago. Mala'ufot, right? What is different about birds? Shekain ein hazar kasher bahem, right? A non-priest isn't allowed to sacrifice birds. So if birds, can only be sacrificed by a priest, tomar b'be'ama katana shehazar kasher ba lo yeheh zman pasul ba. Should we say that in a private altar, where a non-priest is actually allowed to perform sacrifices, that the laws of time don't apply, right? Should we say that if you sacrifice on a private altar, you can eat things after the time designated in the Torah, right? That's what they're asking. Talmud Lomar, lest you think that, don't think that. I can see you thinking that. Don't do it, says the Talmud. V'zot Torah Zevach Hashlamim la'asot zman b'maktana ktana kizman b'magdola. Right? The verse in Leviticus says this is the law of the sacrifice of peace offerings, right? Which it says all peace offerings, right? Which means that the laws of time in a small altar are the same as the laws of time in a great altar. So you can never eat sacrificed animals on either a private or public altar in a way that is not in the appropriate time. And with those inspiring words, Hadran alach parat chatat uslika la masachet Zevachim.
Thank you, Dr. Ronas. And now I don't usually at this point bring comments into the discussion, but Joanna, what you said really sparked my imagination, so I'm going to share it before we turn to the prayers. Joanna says it seemed, because we've of course talked about the transition from sacrifice to prayer, and she says it seems to me that much of the tractate's discussion of sacrificial ritual may be read as a metaphor for prayer ritual. It starts with a discussion of the importance of kavanah, right? We started this tractate with intention in the minds of the priests as they made the tractate, and kavanah is intention in your mind as you say prayers. And it ends with discussing the difference between keva and private prayer, right? We also ended with differences between private altars and public altars, and includes a discussion of how an onain is barred from officiating. So, that's I think just really interesting lens for us to use as we continue through this sacrificial material into menachot. What are we learning about sacrifice that we might want to bring into our prayer practice? Because we don't sacrifice, but we do say prayers. And with that, let us pray. Who's doing the Hadran? Rabbanit Fruchter, you're doing the Hadran?
I've got it. Yes, thank you so much. Okay. Let's do it. Hadran alach masachet zvachim v'adrachalan. Datan alach masachet zvachim v'datachalan. Lo nidnishe minach masachet zvachim v'lo tidnishi minan. Lo ba'alma hadin v'lo ba'alma da'ate. Yiratzon milfanecha, Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu. Shetehei Toratcha u'monotenu ba'olam hazeh, u'tehei imanu le'olam haba. Chanina bar Papa, Rami bar Papa, Nachman bar Papa, Achai bar Papa, Abba bar Papa, Rafram bar Papa, Rachish bar Papa, Sorchav bar Papa, Ada bar Papa, Daru bar Papa. Harevna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha befinu ubepifiot amcha beit Yisrael. Make the words of Torah sweet in our mouths and in the mouths of all of Bnei Yisrael. V'niyanachnu kulanu v'setzenu v'setzei amcha beit Yisrael. Kulanu yodei shemecha v'lamdei Toratecha. Me'oivai techakmeni mitzvotecha ki liolam hili. Yehili bi tamim b'chukecha. Leman lo evosh leolam lo eshkach bikudecha ki vamchi yitani. Baruch atah Adonai lamdeni chukecha. Amen, amen, amen. Sela va'ed. Modim anachnu lefanecha Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu. Shesamta chalkenu mioshvei beit hamedrash. Thank you, God, for bringing us to the base medrash, to this house of study together. V'lo samta chalkenu mioshvei kranot. Instead of doing other things. Shanu mashkimim v'hem mashkimim. Anu mashkimim l'divrei Torah v'hem mashkimim l'dvarim b'telem. Anu amelim v'hem amelim. Anu amelim v'makablim schar v'hem amelim v'enam makablim schar. Anu ratzim v'hem ratzim. Anu ratzim l'chaya olam haba v'hem ratzim l've'er shachat. Shene'amar v'ata Elohim toridim l've'er shachat anshe damim u'mirma lo yechatzu yamehem v'ani eftach bach. Yehi ratzon milfanecha, the final paragraph here, may it be your will, Hashem our God. Keshem shazartani l'sayim, as you've helped us to finish l'sayim masechet zvachim, this tractate, Kain tazreini la'atchil masechtot usfarim acherim u'l'saymam. Give us the strength to finish and start other masechtas, li'lmod u'lamed, to learn and to teach, lishmor v'la'asotu l'kayim, to keep, to do, and to fulfill et kol divrei Talmud Toratecha ba'ava, all of the words of your Torah with love. U'schut kol hataneim v'amoraim, u'talmidei chachamim yamod liu l'zari shelo tamush haTorah mipi u'mipi zari u'mizara zari ad olam. V'yitkayem bi b'yitalach tancha otach b'shach b'cha tishmor alecha b'akitzosa hi tesichecha ki v'yirbu yamecha v'yosifu l'cha shnot chayim orech yamim b'mina b'smola osher v'chavod. Adonai oz la'amo yitain, Adonai yivarech et amo b'shalom. Kaddish.
And of course, this is the Kaddish that talks about rebuilding the temple, but we'll decide what Kulchana Dishmaya is, what the service of heaven is. That's for each of us to imagine in the future. And I'm going to expand a little bit to make it a Kaddish to Rabbanan, which will bless all of those who are learning Torah. Yitkadal v'kadash shemei rabba be'alamadu atidit charate u'lechayim etayu u'askal yaton l'chay alma u'lemivnei karta di Yerushalayim u'leshachlala hechalei begavei u'ma'akar puchana nuchra min ara u'la'atava puchana dishmaya la'atre yamlichu chabrichu machotei v'karei v'chayechon v'mechon v'chayidocho beit Yisrael ba'agalav v'zman kari v'imru amen. Yeshemei Rabba Mavarach Le'alam Umel Mayai Barach V'Yishtabach V'Yipar V'Yimam V'Nasei V'Yidhadar V'Yidalev V'Yidalav Shemei L'Glisha B'Richu Le'Ela Min Kol V'Chadav V'Shiradav V'Chadav V'Nechamata Damiram Be'alma V'Imru Amen Al Yisrael V'Rabbanan V'Al Tamidei Hon V'Al Kol Tamidei Hon V'Al Koman D'Askin Be'Oraita Di B'Atra Hadein V'Di B'Chol Atar V'Atar Yehi L'Hon L'Chon Shlama Rabba Achina V'Chisa Rachamei V'Chayei Richei Mazonei Revichei. For Kanam min Karam avon b'Shmaya v'Ara v'Imru Amen. Yehei Shlama Rabba min Shemaya v'Chaim Tovim Aleinu v'Al Kol Yisrael v'Imru Amen. Oseh Shalom b'Mamav Hu Yaseh b'Rachamav Shalom Aleinu v'Al Kol Yisrael v'Imru Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Hadran alach masechet zvachim. We will return to you, but in the meantime, we are turning the page to some far less bloody sacrifices. Tomorrow's Menachot, which is all about grain sacrifices.
For the vegetarians.
The carb lover, the vegetarian carb lover in me is excited. So we will see you in your inbox tomorrow morning. And if you join us for the Thursday morning review, we'll see you in 3 days on Zoom. And I am wishing everybody a Shabbat Shalom and a good week. And Mazel Tov again on this milestone in our Daf Yomi journey. Thank you to everyone who presented, who commented, who came. It's a pleasure always to learn with you all. Thank you so much.